Herald and News, your news now.
The Herald and News.
Empowering the community.
Basin Views.
Herald and News, your news now. Klamath Falls, Oregon.
The Herald and News.
Podcast. Empowering the community and serving the Klamath Basin. This is the Herald and News Basin Views podcast. Greetings and welcome to Basin Views, a Herald and News podcast featuring interviews with local experts discussing issues important to the Klamath Basin. I'm Kurt Liedtke with the Herald and News. This week, our guest is Kelley Minty-Morris, Klamath County Commissioner, here to recap a busy 2018 for Klamath County, what's in the works now, and what may come up down the road. Commissioner Minty-Morris, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I always like to start these off before we start delving into the nitty-gritty to get to know our guests a little bit more. You certainly, being a local politician, people may know you a little bit more than not, but maybe what are some things that people don't know about Kelley Minty-Morris?
You can find everything out about me by, social media these days. But no, I sort of say that kidding, although I am pretty active on social media, and so I know a lot of people through that. But so I started my career, as you and I were talking before we got live here, as a journalist, actually. So doing things like this is kind of fun for me. I get to revisit my old life. But I started out, grew up in the Willamette Valley. I went to college in Tacoma, Washington, Pacific Lutheran University, studied communication and business. I was just really passionate about journalism, and I wanted to tell stories and give voice to the voiceless and all those really important things that journalists do. So I started as a journalist. I graduated college in just a little over 3 years. I was ready to go, 21 years old, moved to Klamath for the first time to work at KOTI TV. I like to say I was Lyle Ahrens before Lyle Ahrens. And I started my career, slinging a camera around and, again, telling people stories. Got to know a little bit, even back then, about government and the political process and policy making, and was always really fascinated by it, but was just sort of on the other side of it. So I did that. I then moved to upstate New York for 5 years. I worked for a television station there that covered both upstate New York, Vermont, and even a little bit of New Hampshire. And then I was really itching to both get out of journalism. I felt a little bit like it was a job for a young person, and I was getting a little older. And I also was really longing to get back to Oregon. So I ended up moving back to the Klamath Basin. I had fell in love with Klamath as soon as I moved here. So it didn't take any arm twisting to get me to move back here. I came back to work for a nonprofit that probably many people are familiar with called Citizens for Safe Schools. They do really amazing work in the positive youth development field. So I worked as an outreach coordinator and a communication manager for them for 5 years. And then I ran for office, and now here I am.
It's an interesting step to go from journalism to politics. The two are always so intertwined, but they're also at kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. The job of the journalist is to try to pry information out of people who oftentimes don't want to talk. You now being a Klamath County Commissioner, oftentimes, be it executive sessions or other meetings with individuals, you are privy to information oftentimes long before it becomes public. So are there ever times when that little journalism bug kind of goes off in the back of your head and says, that would make a really good exclusive story right now if I was still a journalist?
I think your characterization of the similarity or the tension between the two roles is really good. And I also think, though, there's a lot of similarities, and I think that's why I was drawn to one and then the other. And I think the similarity is we all work for the public. And we're all trying to serve the public. Journalists are trying to serve the public by providing them information so that they can take care of their families, keep their families safe, and be better informed citizens. And then elected officials are also serving the public in that we're trying to provide services and make good policy calls. So I would say at a base level with both roles, I was working for the public, but you're right, there's probably a little tension. I would say what might be a real positive for me having the journalism background is that I truly believe in transparency, and I am always pushing for, and so are my colleagues on the board, we're always pushing for what's the maximum amount that's sort of legally allowable and appropriate and responsible that we can tell the public, because we think people pay our salaries. so they're our boss and deserve to be informed. But it's also a matter of, I think we're all kind of collectively have the ability to be our best selves and our best community when we have access to as much information as possible.
What inspired that jump going from the nonprofit into entering the political fray of running for office?
I get asked that a lot. I think probably all elected officials get asked sort of, why this? And
why would you do this?
Yeah, exactly. Are you bananas? And the answer is yes. No. Really, I don't have one of those total crystallizing aha moments or some one really great issue. It was just kind of this like, hey, Kelley, you love this community. You're super passionate about it. You're the kind of person that jumps in and does anything you can to help and tries to enact change. What a neat platform the commissioner's office would be to be that helper that you already are. And so I think it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't sort of an aha moment, but it was more of just this like this calm voice in my head that said, that's really what you ought to be doing. That's a good place for your skill set if the people want you to do it, right? I mean, elected officials, you have to get elected. And I've always said, I love this job so much. I will stay and do it as long as the voters will have me. But that's the key is it's up to the citizens to get to pick who they want to serve them. And right now, I think that I get a lot of really positive feedback. And right now, I think I'm sort of the right person at the right time. And I hope to continue to be that. And we'll see.
Running for office is such a weird process that oftentimes people don't think about what they're getting into. And then once they're elected, they're like, uh-oh, wait, what did I just get myself into? Has there been any sort of wake-up call moments where you sort of stop and, wow, this is a lot more work than what I was expecting?
I think that it's not necessarily more work than I thought. The one thing that I would maybe identify or point to as something that's been a little more challenging than I was anticipating is that you typically hear from a very vocal minority on any issue. So I have to always remind myself that usually you're sort of hearing the people that have maybe the most negative or the most contrary view to whatever the issue is. And the vast majority of the people are putting in their 8 or 10 hours a day. They're trying to get their kids to school. They're trying to have dinner on the table. They've got a lot of other things going on, and they're not going to take the time to be like, hey, Commissioner Morris, that was a good call on that, or, I like what you're doing there, because they just don't have time, and I don't expect them to, and I don't expect them to really think about that. But you don't get a lot of that kind of normal day in, day out feedback. You tend to hear mostly from people that are
mad.
That are ticked off. And so sometimes I guess I would say to really get to your question of like, is there some days where you're like, why did I do this? You do tend to hear mostly from, I sometimes go home and I'm like, gosh, did I make everybody mad today? Was there anyone who was happy with me? But again, like I said, they're just living their lives and they're not going to check in with their elected officials every day.
Well, and your career path would be best described perhaps as glutton for punishment, considering you're going from journalism, a field where on a daily basis we tend to hear from people only when they're extraordinarily angry at us for some reason, to politicians where, again, there's a no-win situation. No matter what you do, whether you're a journalist or a politician, you're going to make someone angry with every single thing you do. So
exactly.
You just kind of have
so
to
I've
roll with
gotten
it.
used to nobody being happy with me. And that, my dogs, they really love me. They really think I'm great. So I got that going for me.
Well, the role of a county commissioner, growing up, and actually really until recent years when I got into journalism, I really didn't understand what commissioners were and what they did. The only time I ever heard commissioner was, the old Batman 1960s TV show. If you got the red phone that's suddenly dialing up. What is the role of a county commissioner, and how does it, because it's 3 people, how does that panel function?
The role of a county commissioner in somewhere like Klamath is really it's really interesting. So we wear three of us collectively basically wear two hats. So if you want to think of it in a business term, so, oftentimes people are familiar with this model, we are the equivalent of the CEO of the county. So we, at the end of the day, the buck stops here when it comes to hiring and firing department heads. And, we've got 26 departments. Crafting and then implementing and sticking to a budget, being the fiscal agent of the county. All of that at the end of the day rests in the commissioners as their CEO of the county hat. But then additionally, we're also the policymakers for the whole county. So we are the lawmaking branch. So more like the legislators in Salem, we do that at the county level. So policies and ordinances here that are county specific, we work on. So we have those two roles. And like you mentioned, we're a 3-member board. So it's not as though one person is tagged with all of that. It's this collective of 3 independent, individually elected officials, nonpartisan. I think it's a really, I think it's a really great model. I really do. It allows for, sort of these differences of opinion, differences of perspective, differences of experience that then come together to, I think, serve the public really well. There is a constant there's constantly compromise going on between the 3 of us. But what's really great about our board now, and I'll share a quick example. I remember one time the 3 of us were invited to speak out at, I think it was Gold Dust Farms, or it was somewhere, and we each got up. We each had like 5 minutes to talk about our priorities, and it was really interesting because Commissioner Boyd got up and he's very intimately involved in agricultural issues and the water issues, super knowledgeable, brings a really tremendous background and experience. So he was talking about that. Commissioner DeGroot got up and he was talking about, I want to say maybe some like land use related issues and something with assessor and sort of efficiencies of government, and he brought his background to the table. And then I got up and I was talking about Oregon Tech, which I'm really passionate about. I was talking about Kingsley Air Base, which I'm also passionate about, and some of the wellness and health efforts around our community. And it was just fascinating because the 3 of us basically across the board touched on kind of all the hot button issues of the county, and yet we each had expertise in different areas. So I thought, man, I wish all the public could see this. Like, what a great deal they're getting in that we're not all experts in the same issue. In fact, it's quite the opposite, but we all sort of come together in this, like, giving the public a little bit of everything and some expertise in everything. So the 3-member board structure, I think, can be a challenge some places at some time with some individuals. Fortunately, I think as it is now here in Klamath, we've got a pretty good setup going.
It is a nonpartisan position, just like journalists are neutral, but it doesn't mean that we are void of opinions. And that's very true for anyone who has ever attended a commissioner's meeting. Particularly, Commissioner Boyd has some very strong opinions on certain things.
On almost everything.
Yeah. So, that's certainly true, for journalists too. What we present are facts and information based on what's going on, but it doesn't mean that we don't have our own internal opinions in terms of what is happening and why. Because of that, and because of various backgrounds amongst the 3 of you, are there certain areas where perhaps you are the specific liaison to cover because maybe your expertise is more in that area, or it's just something that you're more passionate in? Because Klamath is so massive in terms of scale, and there's so many different issues going on. Even for 3 people, it seems like a lot to try to tackle all of it, right?
It is, and that's where, kind of dovetailing onto my last point, why I think the board as it's made up right now is able to be really effective, probably, and of course I'm terribly biased, but I think we're probably one of the more effective boards of the last few decades because of that exact reason. I think when I look at previous boards, you maybe had great experience, but very similar people with similar opinions and similar backgrounds. And I can see where there's some effectiveness to that, but we really are super unique, and yet are able to kind of respect each other enough to get on the same page as the person who does tend to have the expertise. So I would say, to kind of simplify it for the three of us, well, one distinct difference, Commissioner Boyd is very forthcoming, and it works out really good for our board, that he really doesn't want to go do a lot of advocacy in Salem or Washington, D.C. That's not his thing. He loves the Klamath Basin. He's great, like, guy on the ground, boots on the ground, at the office all the time. He's kind of that guy, and he likes being that guy, and I think it's a good role for him. I, on the other hand, I really enjoy being involved in some of the state level conversations around the areas that I'm passionate in. So, for example, I was appointed to serve on, by the governor, to serve on the Oregon Business Development Commission. I'm very passionate around economic development issues. And I mentioned Oregon Tech. I serve on the board of trustees for Oregon Tech. I'm really passionate about higher ed. And then for the Association of Oregon Counties, I co-chair the Health and Human Services Committee. That's sort of my other area. So I'm doing, I'm here a lot in Klamath, the vast majority of the time, but I also work a lot in Salem and, even travel to Washington, D.C. I think Commissioner DeGroot would probably say he's sort of somewhere in between. And so just at that level, we're divided. You mentioned liaison assignments, and I think that this is something that is good for the public to know. We do employ a liaison commissioner structure, in that at the beginning of each year, we divide up who's going to do what. Because, like I mentioned, we have 26 departments. There is no way one person is going to effectively oversee 26 departments, not to mention the probably 20 plus other boards and groups that we interface with. So we've divided them all out. We work on that collaboratively each year. We've already got ourselves set up for what we're going to be doing in January. If anyone is really deeply interested in that, get a hold of our office. We can send you the list and you can see sort of who does what. But to give a sort of a broad stroke with a brush, a broad brush stroke is the phrase. I'm working as liaison next year to continuing to work with the clerk, our juvenile department, community corrections, the district attorney, public health. Those 5 I know off the top of my head. I have a couple others. And then I mentioned Oregon Tech, Discover Klamath, the Tourism Bureau. We all work with KCEDA, the Klamath County Economic Development Association. And then we each have other areas that we're assigned to.
Klamath County, just in terms of its sheer scale, it's one of the largest counties in the state of Oregon, and in terms of square mileage, Oregon is one of the larger states in the country. Just distance-wise, there's a lot of area traveled, but the majority of the population rests here in Klamath Falls. There are some, small unincorporated communities. For those unincorporated communities that are sort of scattered around, particularly in the northern end of the county, which is large but largely uninhabited too. How do you make sure that that area is not forgotten? How do you represent the entire county just when it's such a massive area and the population is so scattered?
Yeah, that is a challenge. We do have liaison commissioners specifically for Gilchrist, Crescent, some of those areas, to make sure they have a tagged person. And then those communities also have what are called community action teams. So the liaison commissioner will attend their monthly meetings and make sure they know what's going on there. And I would say, there are probably people in some of those areas outside of the more urban area that probably at times feel like they maybe don't see their commissioners enough, but we certainly all give it a good effort. I know over the last year, Commissioner Boyd, for example, has been liaison to Sprague River. And he has spent a lot of time out there, to compliment him and to his credit. So, it's a big county. We drive around a lot. I know I heard sort of similarly, but a little different. I heard someone on Congressman Walden's staff when I was in D.C. recently talking about how his district, which includes Klamath, is the largest in the entire country, right? So to sort of underline your point, Oregon's big, Klamath County's big. We got a lot of ground to cover.
Well, I am curious in terms of jurisdictions and how that works between counties and incorporated cities. Cities that have mayors and town councils, how those relationships work, because they become jurisdiction at city limits, right? So Merrill, Malin, Klamath Falls, places like that, the commissioners aren't necessarily operating those places, whereas, you mentioned Sprague River and Crest and smaller communities, you are essentially the mayor and city council, right?
Correct. So it's, I think that's one thing that can probably be kind of confusing for people is they're like, well, why can't the commissioners do X? And it's something that's really squarely in the city of Klamath Falls. So the way it basically works is, cities are, I guess I'm not sure if this is the most appropriate word, but I'll use this. They're empowered to do what they're going to do. They can have their own ordinances, their own rules, and their own way of doing things. And we cede that, authority to them. And then, but anything outside of those incorporated cities, that's our responsibility. So what's really interesting about the way that Klamath Falls is laid out is that it's really confusing, because you have a city with city boundaries drawn, then you have what's called an urban growth area around it.
In Altamont.
Yes, and the infamous Altamont that's on, a map in Google and yet doesn't exist. So I shouldn't say it exactly like that, but you know what I mean.
Well,
I'm sort of tongue-in-cheek.
I technically live in Altamont, but the only time I know that is when tax season comes around. Is the only time I can figure out what part I live in.
So you've got this urban growth area around it that actually, in our case, is just as populated and just really as big as the city of Klamath Falls. So it's almost like you have these two cities butted up against each other, and it's confusing for people. They say, well, I live in Klamath Falls, that's my address, but they maybe don't live in the city, or they, or they think like, but I'm a county, everybody's a county resident. So it can get really confusing. But I would recommend to people, if you ever really do want to look at it and see the boundaries, the assessor's office, which is just in the Klamath County Government Center, they're wonderful. The assessor, Nathan Bigby, super approachable. They'll help, they'll show you the map and show you where the boundaries are and all of that good stuff.
That now becomes an interesting issue in terms of regulations, because in our November election, some people were curious, well, why couldn't they vote on this issue? And that's because technically they weren't in City of Klamath Falls, but the voters did speak, and Measure 18112 did pass, allowing recreational marijuana in the City of Klamath Falls. This is something that Lake County, our neighbors to the east, have had to deal with, because town of Lakeview opted in when Measure 91 was first passed, but the county opted out. Now, the county still has an opt-out clause, is my understanding, but the obvious conclusion here is that now that Measure 18112 passed in the city of Klamath Falls, the next effort may be to push that on a countywide level. For now, going forward, as regulations become established in terms of how to deal with Measure 18112 and recreational marijuana within the city of Klamath Falls, I can certainly sympathize with our local law enforcement in terms of how they enforce, if I stand here, it's legal, if I stand here, it's not legal, when people don't even know if they're in the city of Klamath Falls or Altamont or urban growth boundary to begin with. Do you foresee some issues in terms of regulations, or has this come up previously with other issues where some areas in incorporated communities it's legal, but you take one step outside of that and suddenly it's a county issue that needs to be addressed?
I think you hit the nail on the head in that it is going to be a challenge for law enforcement. There's going to be a learning curve, both for the public and for our law enforcement, in how this plays out. I'm not privy to how far the city is in terms of the time, manner, place regulations that they've come up with. I'm sort of watching that issue probably in the same way that the public is, as somebody who's not directly involved, but kind of curious about how it rolls out. So it'll be some interesting times. I know there's a lot of smart people working on it and wanting to get it right. I think that's maybe what we should focus on now is that, yes, there's been a lot of controversy around it. But now we need to focus on, all right, the people have spoke, let's get this right.
In one area that I think would be pretty comparable to that is the air quality program that's been going on for several years here to try to improve overall air quality improvement in the city of Klamath Falls. But the restrictions that were placed on that don't apply to urban growth boundary And I think not Altamont folks, it doesn't apply either. Maybe I'm wrong on that. But I've talked to some of the folks that work in public health that have been very frustrated by those efforts in hearing from people who are trying to abide by it, but then their neighbors right across the street are burning on red days and caution days because they're technically in the urban growth boundary.
Right. And there are, again, that's sort of if you look at Klamath Falls in general, just being pretty unique in having such a large urban growth area that really does rival the size of, obviously, the size of a small city because it's basically the same amount of people. It's just something that we have that not every community has that we're going to have to struggle with a little. But I guess what I would suggest to folks is that if this is something they're really passionate about, get involved. There are so many ways to get involved in public service in this community, whether it's serving on an advisory board. Of course, running for office, that's always an option too. But there are just, I think people would be surprised at how many commissions, committees, advisory boards there are where they can get involved and really impact the future of our community. A great example is the Planning Commission. The County Planning Commission and the Klamath Falls City Planning Commission, those are huge decisions that those volunteer members make that really shape the vision and the future of our community. And oftentimes we struggle to get people to volunteer. And I always think to myself, like, oh my gosh, if people knew what an impact you can have by serving on this, they would be like knocking down our door to serve on it. So I would just encourage people, get involved. If you're curious on how to get involved, again, our office is super accessible. Call us, go to the county website, klamathcounty.org, find out how to do it. Very easy, one-page application, super simple stuff. We are looking for good people to help shape the future of this community.
The commissioners acting as essentially CEOs of the county, you are also in charge of finances and budgets. And I know there's lots of different funds that are scattered out. You set a budget, and then throughout the course of the year at various meetings, there's people who come asking for additional funding to help with this or that. I know just recently there were some funds granted to KCC, and then there's been the Klamath Union project and all those. How does budgeting and finance work within the county in terms of all the different funds that you have, from the base numbers that you establish, and then knowing that during the course of the year there may be things that come up?
We have a really wonderful chief finance officer and chief budget officer. Sue and Vicki, they are incredible, very professional, and they are, they're the experts. But we, as the Board of Commissioners, are really intimately involved in all the financial decision making. I guess I would say, maybe to kind of simplify it, we set the priorities, and we say where we think we want resources directed, and then they're really the ones who keep track of, crunch the numbers, I guess is maybe a basic term for it. So yes, the county finance office, which isn't just the finance officer and the budget officer, they're the leadership of it, but it's a 8 to 10 member department that's doing all the stuff that you would think of, again, to use the business model. They're doing things like payroll and accounting and paying bills and all of that, but also keeping track of a budget. So there are a lot of strict rules and laws related to government budgets. You literally can't overspend. You can't not pass a balanced budget. Although some of the things that I think people don't know, because they just always hear like, oh, government spends too much money or whatever. Well, we're literally not legally allowed to not pass a balanced budget. So we do that. But the budgeting piece is, it's a big deal. I mean, you get to decide the priorities of where the dollars go. However, I would share with folks that in many ways you do have some discretion, but not always a ton, because most of the money we get is really restricted on where it can go. Your property tax dollars are what they go into what we call the general fund. That's the fund that we can have some discretion over, but there's lots of other funds, the money that we get from gas tax or the money we get through the federal government, that's very tightly restricted to certain things. So on one hand, yes, we have some discretion, but for people who think like, oh, the commissioners can just kind of spend whatever they want where they want, it's really, it's pretty nailed down and pretty dialed in. There's not a lot of flexibility there.
Is there some frustration that comes up from time to time when organizations don't necessarily understand that? And we've had some recent things come up. There's been some discrepancies with the Klamath Union High School massive remodel, and of course they got hit with increased construction costs from original design. Expenses were raised up, and their first thought was, "Hey, we can just come to the commissioners and ask for a check." That seems to happen often where something gets started and then they kind of look towards the county as a bailout option to help. Does that get frustrating with the budget time? And do you have to kind of anticipate that largely when looking at next year's budget?
So a couple things. I do want to clarify the Klamath Union ask, because I think that's been confusing for people, understandably. So we were given we do have funds that are earmarked for roads that we were able to build up a pretty healthy reserve back in the day when we were getting a lot of what are called secure rural schools dollars. So we built up a really healthy reserve fund, thankfully, to protect our roads and bridges. And a couple years ago, through some legislation that the Oregon legislature worked on, they devised this program basically where you could loan money out of those funds if you were going to get a higher return rate than you were currently getting out of the state investment pool. So basically, before we were required, and I know this gets a little into the weeds, but I think it's important for people to know. So basically in the past, we were required to basically invest our money in the state treasury pool, which really returned like 0.5%. Like we were getting like nothing on those dollars essentially. So the legislature goes, we'll give counties certain counties the ability to loan those funds to essentially other governmental entities for a higher return rate. So basically what we're acting as when we do this project with Klamath Union is we're acting like a bank. We're not acting as the county, and I'm using air quotes, giving them money. We're acting like the bank of Klamath County, loaning you money and you're paying a return on it that's more than we were getting. So we look at it as, well, I guess I should speak for myself, but I'm pretty confident this is what my colleagues would say as well. I mean, I look at it as we're doing right by the county taxpayer because we're getting more of a return of investment by making what we consider a very safe loan, right? I mean, it's the city schools, they're a governmental partner. It's not I've used this phrase before and I hope people kind of get it, but it's not what I would call a mom loan. And what I mean by that, and if my mom listens to this, she'll probably get after me, but it's not like, hey mom, I want to borrow $20 and I might pay you back, I might not type thing. This is written out by lawyers just in the same way a bank would, with penalties if it's not repaid. So this is not the county giving the city schools money because they didn't do right by their project, as some people have characterized it. This is the county getting a better return on dollars that we have sitting in a reserve account. But it does also help the city finish their project, the city schools. So I view it as a real win-win.
Well, and there is a difference between grants and loans, and sometimes that can get confusing because, talking about that Klamath Union project where it is a loan compared to the $50,000 that commissioners just recently pledged to give to Klamath Community College with assistance on their new construction project, the Industrial Skills and Trades Center.
Exactly. And thank you for making that distinction. We did pledge what would be considered more like a grant, a commitment to KCC. I'm thrilled with their project. It really hits on a huge need in not just this community, really around the state, but very prevalent here of those types of jobs that don't aren't college degree, 4-year degree type stuff, but that are super important. We're really lacking in plumbers and electricians and those in the construction field. And I'm really so pleased with our community college for meeting the needs of this community in helping continue to develop a really good workforce.
And that's, the demand for it is obvious. Ask any local electrician or plumber or quality mechanic, maybe they can fit you in 3 weeks from now. So if you're looking for work, maybe the 4-year degree isn't necessarily the correct approach. And I've always felt about this. Both my parents worked in education. A lot of my family's been in education. Not everyone is cut out for 4-year college. But that doesn't mean that they might make an incredible mechanic if vocational training is available, or whatever specific trade field that they want to go into. And there's only going to be more of a demand in those types of fields. It's really important that amidst this cultural trend of thinking, well, you have to go to college, well, you can also have a very successful, very high-paying career going through the alternative of vocational training. So I agree. It is fantastic that KCC is recognizing that and not thinking, well, everyone in today's market has to have a 4-year degree in order to be successful. No, you need to have proper training for whatever field you want to apply yourself in.
Oh, exactly. I mean, I'm a huge fan of higher ed. Like I mentioned before, I sit on the board of trustees for Oregon Tech. Got the 4-year degree thing. I am not kidding. I wish I had the skill set and the passion to be a plumber, because you could write your own ticket. I mean, some of those jobs are incredibly stable, well-compensated jobs that are not highly competitive anymore, because they're just dying for people. I so wish I had that skill set. Then, I wouldn't have people yelling at me all the time. People would actually probably be excited to see me. But in all, I love what I do, but in all honesty, there really are a lot of jobs out there that I hope that we can get our young people engaged in and excited about, because they can write their own ticket then.
Well, your job does involve some travel, as you alluded to, and recently you traveled all the way out to the East Coast. Tell me what exactly you were doing out in Washington, D.C.
I recently made an advocacy trip to Washington, D.C., really specifically to talk about the future of Kingsley Air Base. I feel really strongly that we need to be keeping our eye on what's next for Kingsley. We know the F-15 is an aging aircraft. It's a wonderful aircraft that has, continues to serve us well and has served us well, but it's an aging aircraft. Kingsley is, and I mean, I can't really overstate this. Kingsley is one of the major gems of this community, and not just this community, for the state of Oregon and for this country.
Well, and the relationship between the Air Force and the community in general is really unique, too.
It's super unique. I mean, we are the only place in the country where an air base has a lease with a city that goes out 95 years. In fact, to hear Colonel Smith talk about it on the Air Force side, the people in the chain were like, what? You got a 95-year lease? Like, how'd you pull that off? Nobody's getting that. And it's because of this community's commitment to the base. Not to mention the fact that our airspace is really unique in its uncongestedness, if that's a word. We'll have to look that up later. But the fact that it's not congested, I'll say it that way, our guys and gals can get up at any hours of the day, as much as they want. They have that community support, so they don't get noise complaints. And this is a huge issue that many people probably don't think of. We're one of the few areas where there's not what they call encroachment issues. So a really, growing urban area that's just butting right up against the base. They've got room to breathe out there. So because of all those things, Kingsley is a huge asset for our country. So I went to D.C. to make sure that the members of the Senate Arms Committee, their staffers who work on legislative issues, specifically around military-related issues, that they know what Kingsley is, that they've heard of it, why it's such an incredible asset, and that we're poised and ready for a future mission. I felt like the trip was really successful. I was very well received. I was in offices like Senator Kane, Senator Cotton, Senator King, and then, of course, our Oregon delegation, reminding Senators Wyden and Merkley, these are some of the things we could be doing, and then, of course, spent some time with Congressman Walden. So it was a fast and furious 2 days in Washington, D.C., but I feel like that's part of my charge and my job, to work on the political side. You've got the Air Force side, and we have some amazing leadership at Kingsley Air Base. Of course, Colonel Smith, and then lots of others. They're doing great work on the military side, but then there's the political side too, and that's the side I get to work on.
There's another aspect of politicians that I've always been somewhat envious of, and I don't know how they do it. And you bring up Senator Wyden's name. Every time that Senator Wyden comes to town, that I've covered a town hall or an event, he always remembers me. And he remembers that I spent time in LA, that I worked in the entertainment industry before I got into journalism, that I'm a Duck fan. He remembers, it floors me every time. And to an extent, I know you interact with a lot of different people, but on a more local level. But so many people who are in politics have this incredible ability to remember everyone that they encounter and things about them. Now, just stop and think for a moment, how many people over the course of a day senators interact with? And the fact that someone could remember every year details about someone and who they are and their name every single time. I'm like, how do you do that? That's incredible.
It is. But what I think it speaks to is that at the end of the day, I know a lot of people are critical of quote unquote politicians. I use the term elected officials. I know a lot of people are critical of them, us. But I think what it speaks to is really most people get into this because they genuinely like and want to help people. I think this politics has gotten so bananas with and so much tensions on both ends. It is not reserved for conservatives or liberals, or it's on all sides. Everybody's there's a lot of people that are being nasty to a lot of people. But I think if you really kind of think about the people that are drawn to becoming an elected official, it's probably because they want to help people, not because they're some evil genius that wants to manipulate people. It's probably because they like people. It's probably because they want to help people. At least that's what I like to think. So to your point of, how do they remember? It's probably because they like you. It's they probably like most of the people that they meet, and so they take an interest. And but I've noticed that too. I've joked. Well, Congressman Walden is honestly, in my mind, one of the most incredible humans, because not only can he do that, but he remembers everything about every topic you've even talked about. And I get blown away because I'm like, can somebody trip this guy up? Throw something at him that he doesn't know something about. It's like every time you talk to him, the guy knows everything about, and not in an arrogant way, but he just knows everything about everything and everyone and remembers. And yeah, they're all pretty incredible.
I wish I was wired that way, because there's some days I can't remember what I did 5 minutes ago. It always surprises me anytime that there's a trial going on and they're asking a witness, what happened January 3rd, 1987? Where were you? It's like, I don't even remember what I did last week. How are you supposed to?
I'm with you.
Well, let's talk about 2018, because we are coming to the very tail end of the year now. It's been a very busy year in the commissioner's office. Are there any issues that you've been able to tackle you're particularly proud of? Anything that's still kind of left open that's concerning, or things that you're looking at coming into the next year? Give us kind of a recap of the work that was done in 2018.
2018 has been a really, really busy year around our office. And I want to take this moment first to compliment my fellow commissioners. They have each, in their own respect and sort of in their own lane of interest, been working really hard on a lot of projects. I would say that some of the things that rise to the top of my memory, and like we were just saying, I'm like, what, did I eat breakfast this morning? It does get kind of hard to remember. But I would say to go maybe big picture on some of the things that we've worked on. We're all really passionate around cleaning up this community, the blight issue. So, and that has a lot of different formats. We've worked on getting rid of blighted properties in the county. We've worked on setting up a program where there will be some funding available for community cleanup. We've worked on just, what's the word I want to use? Just selling off basically county properties that weren't being used to get them in better hands, and then also to get funding to then help support some of these cleanup efforts. So I would say one major priority for all three of our board members, and Commissioner Boyd has definitely taken the lead on this, has been this general, let's get this community looking better. Let's do more code enforcement. That's been huge. That's been a huge priority really for all three of us, that we've put a lot more resources and attention on. And a special little shout out to not only our code enforcement office, but our staff in the commissioner's office has also been engaged on that, as well as some volunteers. So code enforcement, blight cleanup has been a huge area that we've all worked on, that I think a lot has been accomplished in 2018. I would also say economic development continues to be a huge priority area for the board. We've directed more resources toward KCEDA over the last handful of years than used to be done in the past, because we really believe that having a robust economic development agency is very important, because that's important to all of us. And then we've all gotten involved in different projects as they've come and they've sort of fit in with our different skill sets. Economic development, community cleanup, and blight. And then I might identify thirdly, just general governmental efficiency has been important to all three of us, and has come up in different ways over the year. But things like do we have the right amount of vehicles? Do we have the right fleet size? Are we making things as efficient as we can for the end user, the member of the public? Like, can they use a debit card and a credit card when they come to pay a county bill? Things like that just sort of speak to efficiency. And this is where, again, we each bring our unique perspective. We've each kind of tackled it in different ways and bitten off different pieces. But I would say, in general, I can say confidently that after an entire year, Klamath looks better. We have more economic development related activity going on, just more growth in general. And we have a greater level of efficiency in the way we provide governmental services, which I think is pretty good for a year.
Any specific projects that were completed over the course of the year that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, there have been, and now, we've been talking a long time and my brain's getting a little shaky. I mean, it's honestly because there have been probably so many. Like I said, we've stood up this whole blight community cleanup program that literally wasn't there before. We've invested more resources in code enforcement, so now we have a volunteer code enforcement team and our code enforcement officers that can go and take a picture, or the public can take a picture of something they think is in code violation or an eyesore, shoot it to our staff, and we can have a code enforcement officer look at it right away. We weren't doing those kind of things before. One project that I'm incredibly proud of, that's I think the quintessential doing government right project, is a project our Public Works Department just completed on Old Fort Road. We had community members from that live on that road coming to, I think it was even as far back as the previous board, but certainly this board too, saying our road is dangerous in the winter. We have, regularly have people sliding off. It gets super icy, just the way, it doesn't get hit by the sun. And, could we get it paved this? So we had our Public Works Department start to look into it. Initially, we got proposals. We had an engineering firm do some work that were in the sort of on the low end. The low cost proposal was maybe $1.3 million. The full enchilada proposal was something like $3.5 million to pave it all the way. Our Public Works Director, Jeremy Morris, really highly qualified guy, been here maybe a little over a year, said, I'm looking at this. What if we did, and he had a totally different idea that was incredibly low cost, literally ended up being something that our crews could do to kind of do some widening and some changes and tweaks to the grade, where he was able to do a project mostly with our own crews that was something like, I'm not kidding, like $30,000. Fixed. We are getting letters and kudos and phone calls from the Old Fort Road residents. Oh my gosh, thank you so much for fixing our road. It's the best it's been. So this is something that could have cost, had we been more careless about it, $3.5 million. got it done in a way that really is serving the public, and it's done for like $30,000. I mean, that's something I think our board can be really proud of.
What are some of the issues that the commissioners are currently addressing or looking at delving into in 2019?
The Klamath County Commissioners are going to be continuing to look at how do we promote business and economic growth here. We're going to be continuing to look at our budget. It's been a challenge that over the last several years we've needed to use reserve dollars to basically continue to fund the sheriff at the level that we all think is appropriate. It's not the worst thing in the world. I mean, that's why you have reserve dollars, but it's not sustainable forever. So we are depleting our dollars, our reserve dollars, both in the money that we really should be utilizing for public works to do roads and bridges, and also, using them to fill this sort of yearly hole for the sheriff. So we're going to need to try to figure out a long-term solution for that. I would say that's a biggie. Continuing to figure out how to be the most business friendly and promote economic development. And then finally, I know we're all really committed to actually doing intentionally a strategic planning process, which when you look at an animal as big as county government with 26 different departments, that's going to be a big project. But you also, it's hard to get somewhere where you don't know where you're trying to go. So we all think that doing some actual strategic planning is really important.
Over the course of your time as a commissioner, is there one accomplishment that you are proudest of? Or one moment where you kind of came in and felt like, hey, I saved the day, all right.
That's a really tough question. There's a lot of things I'm proud of. I don't know if this, I feel like this is a really hard question. I'm not going to maybe say that this is the one, but I will tell you one. So one thing that I am very, very proud of is our recent designation, Klamath County, by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, getting the Culture of Health Prize. Here's why I'm really proud of that. This is a community that has ranked, of the 36 counties, like 35th in terms of the worst health outcomes. And yet several years ago, with the inspiring people like, Stephanie and Catherine Pope, they worked and they brought the Blue Zones Project here. And, some people have a little bit of a bad taste in their mouth about the Blue Zones Project. And I could talk hours on end about why the Blue Zones Project is really good in doing the right thing. But the bottom line is it got people focused on something positive. It's hard to really say that we don't want our community to be vibrant and healthy and an attractive community where people want to come. So what the Blue Zones Project really does is kind of rally everyone on the same page, at least, about let's try to make our people healthier. Let's make our community viable into the future. What the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Culture of Health Prize did was recognize all these strides that this community is making. So here you have this community that several years ago was ranking almost dead last in health outcomes, getting this super prestigious prize that only 4 communities in the whole nation got this year. That's incredible. We're only the second time an Oregon community has ever got this distinction. So that's a really, really big deal. So whether I say it's maybe the best thing that I've been part of in office, I'm not sure. But it's certainly one thing that I think our whole community should be incredibly, incredibly proud of.
Final question, then we'll let you go. I appreciate all of your time here. Looking ahead, as you mentioned briefly in that response, Klamath County was largely built on the timber industry. The timber industry will always be a part of Klamath County, but it will never be what it once was. This community and this area is one that's having to adjust, sometimes grudgingly so, adjust to changing times. Over in Lake County, there's been very heavy investment in renewable energies and solar panels and geothermal, and they're really trying to look at that as their future biofuel production, as opposed to thinking, well, we will just survive in the old ways. How is Klamath County going to survive going forward, being viable into the future?
I think what's really special about Klamath County is what a diverse set of strengths that we have. So you're right. We have, we've had timber. We have had a natural resource-based economy, and that has served us very well. We've been very fortunate to have in the past such an abundance of timber resources. We have agriculture. That's huge. I mean, I didn't know this until I've actually heard this cited before, but I sometimes forget. We're the biggest organic agricultural place in the state. I don't think people think about that when they think of Klamath. That's an incredible resource that we have here. I mentioned several times Kingsley Air Base. I mean, we are the only place that trains F-15 pilots. And then, of course, I talk so much about Oregon Tech and KCC. There are so many communities in this state that would die to have the higher ed, the caliber of higher ed that, Oregon Tech is turning out some of the most amazing graduates, not only in our state, they're statistically the people that are the highest paid upon graduation, but really, like in the whole Pacific Northwest, regularly recognized as being amazing in that respect. And then you mentioned renewable energy. That's a huge booming area. Klamath County, not just energy in general, we are an energy powerhouse. So when you talk about the potential of energy, natural resource development, what we have going on with the military, and then higher ed and agriculture and timber, it's incredible the diversity of areas of opportunity that we have here. And I think what's really important for all of us is to remember that we can continue to redefine who we are based on all these amazing attributes. We don't have to just be one thing. And we certainly should never think that our best days are behind us. I completely believe our best days are still ahead of us.
Our guest today has been Kelley Minty-Morris, Klamath County Commissioner. Kelley, thank you for taking some time out to speak to us about a wide variety of topics that we've covered today. And best of luck going forward in terms of all of the difficult issues that the commissioners have to tackle in 2019.
Thanks, and I hope everyone, has a wonderful holiday.